So what do you think of this? There was a guy who had a celebration, and as part of the feast, he had a large variety of soups to serve the people who came to the celebration. When the celebration was over, he had a lot of soup left over. Small amounts of some varieties and large amounts of other varieties. A couple of days later, the same guy was having a smaller gathering and decided he could use the leftover soups to feed the people at that gathering. But to ensure that he had enough, he decided to mix all the soups together and call it the mystery soup. Now, isn't this an ingenious way to minimize cost and maximize profit? Well, in a certain way, I think this is what Jesus is complimenting the dishonest steward for. I think it is important to acknowledge that this parable is kind of like a bridge between the parable of the prodigal son that we heard last week and the parable of the rich man and Lazarus that we will hear next week. And if you recall, last week, the word prodigal meant exorbitant or extravagantly wasteful. The prodigal son was extravagantly wasteful of his father's inheritance. And now we see the prodigal steward is extravagantly wasteful of the master's property. The prodigal son is admired for his willingness to return to the father, whereas the prodigal steward is praised for his dishonesty. So it seems. So we need to look at this a bit more closely to see what's really going on. You see, the rich man comes to his steward looking for what he has coming to him, namely his money. He had heard that the steward was taking advantage of him. Now, whether the steward was stealing from the rich man or not isn't the main point, although he probably was. And whether the steward reducing the debt of various others who owed his master was honest or dishonest is not the point of the parable either. Because the main point is that the steward was clever, or, as the parable says, prudent, and wasted no time in planning for a secure future for himself. Prudence means having the knowledge of what a person needs to do and the concrete means to accomplish it. For example, I might know that prayer is good for me, or exercise is good for me. But if I never get around to praying or exercising, I am not being prudent. And so the point that Jesus is making is not to commend the devious steward, but to acknowledge the value of his cleverness in planning for his future. Our life in this world is temporary. Eternity is forever. So Jesus is telling us to use the blessings that God has given to us to help us get closer to him and not let anything get in the way of our relationship with him in preparing for eternity. In other words, if worldly people are capable of making great sacrifices for worldly goals, how much more are we Christians capable of making even greater sacrifices for Jesus and for God's kingdom? So this leads to some questions. Why are worldly people more willing to sacrifice for worldly rewards than Christians are for heavenly rewards? Or more specifically, why are we ourselves more willing to sacrifice for worldly rewards than we are for heavenly ones? We can see this in our lives clearly when we ask the question, why are we more willing to treat strangers kindly for financial gains than we are our own family members for heavenly gains? Think about this. We can blow off family members so quickly because we'd rather not make a sacrifice for them because they are just annoying, right? But if we know Grandma is going to slip us a $20 bill, we warm up to her awful quickly, don't we? Think about young people. When Grandma pulls out money, oh man, they're warming right up to her. Someone can make a Facebook post that is likely to stir up gossip instead of trying to diffuse it before it goes so far. We can come up with all sorts of creative ways to cut a business deal that will profit us. But we can't think of a single creative way to strike up a conversation with a fallen away Catholic to make them think about going to confession or coming to Mass. We can give all sorts of advice on what someone else needs to do to make themselves better prepared for heaven. But we can't do something simple to address our own struggles and our own sinful habits. You see, the bottom line is, are we willing to put as much ingenuity and to be as clever or use as much prudence in working toward heaven as we are in working toward some worldly reward?